Captain James T. Kirk of the Starship Enterprise has done it all. Of course, all doesn't always mean good. If you look past the grandiose heroic moments, you'll find that Kirk's lauded career is full of truly terrible actions on virtually every level. A piece of Kirk's past that comes up during the run of the original series forms the background for Season 2's Obsession, which involves Kirk being obsessed. You probably saw that one coming. The object of said obsession is a cloud of deadly vampiric space gas that Kirk had previously encountered in his pre-Enterprise days when he was serving on board the USS Farragut. Back then, he'd hesitated rather than destroy the creature, which led to the captain and half of the crew being, to quote Spock, annihilated.
In brief, Doctor, nearly half the crew and the captain were annihilated.
That regret leads the crew into a sort of ersatz Moby Dick as Kirk diverts the ship from its mission in an effort to track down the space gas and kill it. His quest for vengeance ultimately winds up with 6 members of the crew, including Spock, getting their blood sucked out, and 3 deaths as a result. In fact, the only reason Spock survives is that this particular Misty Dracula prefers human hemoglobin to the Vulcan's infamous green blood. At one point, it gets so bad that McCoy and Spock attempt to relieve Kirk of his command, and for good reason. The crew of the Enterprise may be willing to risk their lives in battle or in the name of exploration, but death by exsanguination because the captain is obsessively fixated on an evil space fart is a pretty big ask for anyone. If there's one thing Star Trek loves, it's evil duplicates. Before the infamous mirror universe was introduced in the original series, Kirk had another experience in doubled troubles when a transporter accidentally split him into 2 different Kirks. Naturally, one was good and one was evil, and when we say evil, we mean it. Bad Kirk sexually assaults yeoman Janice Rand in a scene that is still genuinely harrowing and upsetting to watch over 50 years later, and she only escapes when she scratches his face, giving the audience a convenient way to tell them apart. It is on a very visceral level the worst thing viewers ever saw Kirk do, and it's worth remembering that this wasn't a Mirror Universe version. This was a part of the real Kirk, a terrible piece of his personality that was always there, and would be once more when it was added back to the whole, which is a very disturbing plot point to contemplate. Even good Kirk sucked, just in a completely different way. He wasn't running around trying to force himself on members of the crew, but he was weak-willed, indecisive, and easily manipulated. Bad Kirk even takes advantage of his counterpart's spineless nature to escape and attempt to assault Rand again. The worst part? The entire point of the episode is that Kirk actually needs both terrible halves of his personality to function as a human being, with McCoy even saying that bad Kirk isn't actually bad.
We all have our darker side. We need it. It's half of what we are. It's not really ugly, it's human.
That's a rough diagnosis, Doc. The Trouble with Tribbles is remembered as one of the most fun episodes of Star Trek, and for good reason. It introduces the iconic furballs and their tendency to breed exponentially, gives the viewers the best bit of physical comedy in the show's entire 79-episode run when Kirk is buried in a pile of them, and even manages to tie its goofy plot into the oh-so-serious looming threat of war with the Klingons. It's a fun, lighthearted romp that everyone can enjoy. Unless you start thinking about what happens after the credits roll, that is. In order to rid the Enterprise of its Tribble problem, Kirk and his crew beam them over to a departing Klingon ship. Considering that there is a very real, albeit comedic, threat to the Enterprise from the Tribbles overbreeding and gorging themselves on both the ship's stores and an entire planet's food supply, this act is essentially dooming the Klingons and the Tribbles on board their ship. It's said that a single Tribble can potentially have 100,000 descendants in about 2 days, so there's no way the Klingons' food supply is going to survive more than a few minutes. So either the Tribbles eat the Klingons, or the other way around. This isn't just conjecture either. In an episode of Deep Space Nine, which takes place about a century after the trouble with the Tribbles, there's a mention of the Great Tribble Hunt, where the Klingon Empire eradicated the entire species from the galaxy after they became an ecological threat of cosmic proportions.
Hundreds of warriors were sent to track them down throughout the galaxy. An armada obliterated the Tribble homeworld. By the end of the 23rd century, they had been eradicated.
It's unclear whether outer space is subject to the Geneva Conventions, but that kind of devastating biological warfare should probably be brought up at Kirk's next evaluation. In retrospect, it's a little weird that so much of what happens in the Star Trek movies is based around Kirk getting his buddies back together to fix all the stuff he screwed up 2 decades earlier. The prime example comes, of course, from Space Seed. This episode from the first season of the original TV series wound up getting a direct sequel on the big screen in 1982's Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. In the original episode, Kirk discovers a frozen tyrant who's really into eugenics, and who decides to take over the Enterprise as his first step toward conquering Earth. Kirk's reaction? He just drops him and his pals into SETI Alpha 5, rewards him with an entire planet to, quote, tame, and assumes that this decision will never come back to bite him. Surprise, 15 years later, it all comes back to bite him in a truly staggering example of what happens when you mix overconfidence, gross negligence, and a tendency to piss off everyone around you. It turns out that leaving a villainous genetic Superman with an intense thirst for revenge alone on his own planet, with unlimited resources and an easily exploited workforce, is a singularly terrible idea. Even worse, despite the fact that Kirk put him on trial for his crimes, nobody bothered to check on Khan at all, even when the neighboring planet exploded. At the very least, planetary destruction is the sort of thing you'd think Starfleet would keep track of, which raises the question of whether Kirk bothered to report any of this at all. Either way, two sets of horrible decisions 15 years apart lead directly to his best friend dying of radiation poisoning. That's a pretty rough consequence, but given how hard he screwed the Tribble on this one, it's the least you can expect. There's really a litany of Kirk's mistakes leading to the events of Star Trek II, including the first of the movie's big reveals, David Marcus, Kirk's long-forgotten son who never knew his father since Kirk decided to boldly go away from any parental responsibilities. To be entirely fair to Jim T, we learn in the movie that his absence from David's life came at the request of David's mother, Carol.
I did what you wanted. I stayed away.
She recognized that both she and Kirk were devoted to their careers, and he wasn't about to give up command of a starship on a mission to explore the final frontier and the accompanying endless stream of sexy robots and half-naked green ladies that went along with it. Rather than co-parenting across parsecs, she told Kirk that she wanted to raise David alone, presumably because being a single mom is a little easier in the 23rd century. With that, Kirk happily went back to the Enterprise without ever mentioning that he had at least one kid out there. Also, to his credit, once he reconnects with his adult son, Kirk does make an effort. That's something, even if it leads to the most awkward hug of all time. But real talk, it's totally fine to prefer cruising around the galaxy to being a stay-at-home dad, but if that's your deal, then maybe don't have a kid. Or if you do have a child, maybe make the slightest effort to be present in their life rather than just agreeing that your job is way more important and bailing to the beta quadrant. Oh well, what's the worst that could happen? It's not like David's going to grow up wanting to prove something to his absent father and wind up getting stabbed in the chest while trying to wrestle Klingons, right? Right. If The Wrath of Khan is about Kirk having to fix his past mistakes, then Star Trek III: The Search for Spock is built around James T racking up an entirely new set of charges. Over the course of the film, Kirk not only manages to hijack his former spaceship and speed off on an unauthorized mission to go dig up his best friend's dead body, he also does what the Klingons, the Romulans, and all of the Federation's other enemies never managed to do. He blows up the Enterprise. Oh, and this also leads directly to Kirk's son getting knifed to death, but let's be real here. David Marcus had only been around since the previous film, and while Kirk spent some time getting Moby and listening to the 23rd century version of Cats in the Cradle, the audience didn't really have much of a connection to him. The Enterprise, though? The ship that had carried our crew to all those strange new worlds, that had taken our breath away when we saw it rebuilt in Star Trek the Motion Picture? It was a way more important piece of Star Trek than an estranged son, and when it was destroyed, it was Kirk who gave the order. The 2009 Star Trek reboot shifted everything into an alternate timeline, letting the franchise revisit characters of the original series while telling new stories that weren't set in stone by the future history of the next generation. While most of the characters are the same, there are some huge differences in how the events play out. The planet Vulcan is destroyed, for example, and rather than the militaristic aesthetic of the original Enterprise, everything in the new timeline looks like it's happening in an Apple store. Some things, however, are so deeply ingrained in the universe that they persist throughout the divisions between realities, and one of them is the fact that James Kirk is a horny creep. The rebooted movies present him as a habitual womanizer who can't even be bothered to remember the names of the people he's sleeping with, which actually is a big change.
You have no idea who I'm talking about, do you?
Say what you will about original Kirk space-seating his way across the galaxy, but he never seemed like he was emotionally detached. The worst example comes in Star Trek Beyond when he meets that timeline's version of Carol Marcus. She asks him to turn around so she can strip out of her uniform for some reason, only for him to start leering at her over his shoulder after taking a peek. Again, in fairness, he doesn't know she's stripping to her Starfleet skivvies when his curiosity initially gets the better of him, but once he does know, he definitely doesn't look away until she starts to get miffed. That long moment spent ogling her could probably be chalked up to surprise if he wasn't hitting on her a few seconds before, despite being her superior officer. Who's in charge of HR on the Enterprise these days? To put it kindly, Star Trek Beyond is not exactly Kirk's finest moment. In fact, the cascading series of terrible decisions that make up the plot of that film might just represent the worst thing Kirk has done across any timeline. At the start of the film, Kirk is trying to get a promotion to Vice Admiral, essentially because he's grown bored of trekking through the stars and wants to quit. Look, there's nothing wrong with wanting to advance your career, but I don't want to be the captain of a starship and have a bunch of adventures isn't exactly the most endearing motivation for any character, let alone James T. Kirk. Either way, Kirk's desire to bail on the Enterprise might have been the factor that led to his next mission going so disastrously wrong. While it's under Kirk's command, the Enterprise is boarded by hostile forces who slaughter most of the crew, with the survivors abandoning the ship before it's destroyed. Maybe next time, just go ahead and put in your 2 weeks' notice. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.